Attention, pod people around the planet. Welcome to Mark and Pete. Now, here's a thought.
Our podcast is for every dominion and engages like a rack and pinion with Pete's receding crinion, Mark, who's a minion. Together we form half an opinion. Well, indeed, podcasters throughout the world. Now, what really is a podcast? It is, without any doubt, one of the growing communication formats that we have seen for many, many years. But the term podcast is, in fact, a portmanteau of iPod and broadcast. And the earliest usage of podcasting can be traced back to the Guardian columnist and BBC journalist Ben Hammersley. And he first coined this particular podcast term back in February 2004, whilst reading a particular Guardian newspaper article. Well, I must say that podcasts are flourishing. Yes, and with me is Mr. Pete Pod. What do you think of podcasting? And more importantly, how significant are you starting to see podcasts changing the world?
Well, Mr. Podmark, I've got to say that podcasts, I noted that they were suddenly very popular. I started listening to them to myself a decade ago, and was interested in them because they were like radio. Like to listen to radio, but this was radio on demand. I thought this was brilliant. I could listen to things whenever I wanted. But the significance of them didn't really hit home to me until last year. They're almost like a second surge. I don't know if you remember when we were but wee lads at school, Mark, there was a popular entertainment amongst the kiddywinks of going on skateboards, and I thought they'd disappear because they were a ridiculous form of transport. But then they suddenly came back years later. It's a bit like that with podcasts. Podcasts had an initial surge of interest, seemed to be in the background, but they were gradually growing and growing in reality, and suddenly surged into popularity again. And last year, what did I notice? Well, I noticed the US president's election, which we talked about a lot on our podcast, was, well, not quite decided, but was only influenced by podcasts. Looks like that's where people get their news these days.
Well, indeed, because as you quite rightly say, when we were young in the 19th century, or was it the 18th century? I can't remember. It seems such a long time ago. I was hopping and bopping around on a space hopper. We're hopping and bopping about on a podcast, and that's really where we need to be. But the thing is that isn't it remarkable, some of the statistics? If you think of the growing popularity of podcasting, you can see that, not only are broadcasters such as politicians and business people using it, but pretty much anyone who's anybody who's got access to the internet can podcast. Now, that means you get insights to what people think in their hobbies, insights to what they think about their business, but also just their general views on the world. Now, if you take some of the interesting things that have been going on, so US iHeartRadio podcast listeners will be reaching over 33 million, increasing dramatically year on year, as we are seeing. But also, more importantly, is that the iHeartRadio, for example, along with many other platforms, are claiming a very large proportion of the podcast listeners around the world. Now, I will say that probably some of the biggest podcasters are in the United States, but
Sure.
Europe and Asia are catching up fast.
Yes. Yeah. And we broadcast initially, although I don't know what people are listening on because we're available on all the big podcast platforms and quite a few of the smaller ones as well. We broadcast initially on Spreaker each week, and then it gets disseminated out to these different platforms. Now, Spreaker is part of iHeartRadio. Spreaker itself was responsible for 13.5% of all new podcast episodes. So we're in good company there, and that's up 5% from the previous year. So it's really growing. And we also find, looking at our stats, that all the time about half of our listeners, just over half, are in the US, even though we're broadcasting from the UK, a little backwater over near Europe, in case people don't know it. And we managed to reach people there, and across in other English-speaking places like Singapore, for example. We have quite a few people listening. Maybe that's where you are, gentle listener. So one of the impressive things that I see from this is, yes, there's a big concentration in America, but as you say, out in the Far East and other places, they're catching up. The reach of podcasts is worldwide, which you didn't really get with radio until they went online, and even then, people weren't tuning in from different places in the world necessarily. In fact, the statistics show that unless you're specific worldwide station, and so we are finding that podcasts reach everywhere in the world. So you've got a huge possible audience, and it's looking like that's the future.
Well, it is, but more importantly, what's interesting is more and more people are spending more time listening. Back in 2020, typically people would probably podcast for maybe 10, 15 minutes, but it's amazing that most people are starting to sort of listen up to half an hour, maybe even an hour a day,
Yeah,
just simply listening to their favorite channels, favorite podcasters. Now, of course, as we said, the United States is one of the biggest listeners and indeed content generators. But let's be honest, it's content that's key
yeah,
because what we want is opinions.
yes.
Now, Mr. Pete, I ask you, what really sort of makes you hooked into a podcast?
Well, Mark Pod. I mean, there are two things. One is I've got to find the person interesting, obviously, so I don't want someone just droning on. So for them interesting, amusing, and I guess I have to admit that if I find that they're aligned with me in worldview, not in all their opinions, but in worldview. So if they're Christian, or if they're not Christian but they're conservative, or if they're not Christian or conservative, they're in favour of free markets. Something I can key into, something where there's some sort of understanding. I'd find it difficult. I wouldn't be so interested in someone who didn't share my worldview, apart from for listening just out of occasional interest, just to get complete opposite point of view. But also, I find it a good way of keeping up to the minute. Let me give you one particular podcast. The podcast by Ted Cruz, Verdict with Ted Cruz, has up to the minute news from the Senate in the US. And he is actually a senator, so you get really good insights. So those are what would interest me and get me keyed into a particular podcast, and why I keep listening to them. In fact, because you find that you can find different podcasts for different things you're interested in, where you get up to the minute news and people who actually know what they're talking about, maybe because they're actually there. Then it's better than mainstream news, mainstream media news. In fact, I saw a stat. This is from a couple of years ago, but from Pew Research, they say 2/3 of podcast listeners get their news content first from podcasts. Well, yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's the case with me as well.
I think there's something slightly more significant. Now, we all know that podcasting is there to entertain. But look, let's be honest, it is a business. And
Yeah,
from my point of
sure.
view, this is intriguing because advertisers spend a staggering 2.28 billion and growing
Yes.
on advertising on podcast, and that's an incredible uplift year on year, which we're seeing. And this is statistics, incidentally, from eMarketer forecasts.
Yeah.
But what's also incredible is that when you look at some of the big ones, even US iHeartMedia podcasts, their ad revenues have actually hit a staggering $435 million in 2024 alone. So in 2025, well, you can see that this is a nice little earner, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it's a nice little learner and very important part of the economy. I mean, we're talking about, I guess, increasingly the world economy. It was valued. I've got the valued here. It was valued recently. Let me see. I've got the stats up to the end of 2024 at $34 billion, which is up from 21.4 billion in 22. That's a good sign of the market growth, and doesn't seem to be slowing down, of course. But it's not just that. It's not just about money, although of course money is great. I use it all the time. But it's about getting a message out, and on Mark and Pete, because we have our message about long-termism, localism for politics, about the importance of faith in God for a good society and a good life. That sort of thing's important to us. And other podcasts have their own specific message, and it's a better way of getting it out because getting your message out because you don't have those gatekeepers, people getting in the way of saying, oh, you can't say that. You don't as much get that. What you still get on some of these platforms is a strangling of your reach if you have an unpopular opinion in your podcast. But hopefully, we're seeing less of that, certainly in the US market with the great President Trump. Of course, we're big fans of Trump. Oh, and every president, obviously, on this show. But of Trump's move to um, free up free speech, which is how it should be. But yes, Mark and Pete is part of part of a whole plethora of different podcasts, which is going to give comments on news. Of course, we give comment on culture, religion, and business and everything. There's so many to choose from, but of course, Mark and Pete is the best. So, what can I say?
Well, more importantly, podcasts are there to interact, and what
Yes.
we'd love, pod people all around the world.
Pod people
What
of the
do you want us to talk about? What are the things that get you excited, and what do you want to listen to?
Yes, get in touch with us. You just go to markandpete.com and you can leave a message on this and, in fact, every episode. Make sure you subscribe because you don't want to miss out on Mark and Pete, and we'll catch you on all those different podcast episodes coming up. See you soon.